This is episode 276 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. I am very pleased to be joined this week by Christian Robey. He is Vice President of External Affairs at the Media Research Center in the Washington, D.C. area. Welcome to Tipping Point, New Mexico, Christian.
Thanks for having me on, Paul.
Yeah, well, so much going on in the area we're going to be talking about today, which is media censorship and big tech censorship. But before we get started, talk a little bit about the Media Research Center and what it does, and especially the Free Speech Alliance, of which the Rio Grande Foundation is a part.
Sure. So the Media Research Center was launched over 30 years ago. And at that time, there were claims by conservatives in the media that, well, claims by conservatives overall that the media were liberal, and that as a result that they had an impact on people's views, they had an impact on politics, on the culture. But there wasn't really anything out there. There was only anecdotal evidence. So what Brent set out to do was to prove this scientifically. And that's what he did. And over the course of the 30 years, we have seen a shift in Americans' trusting of the media as an institution, from mostly trusting around 80% 30 years ago to a complete flip-flop, where now close to 80% don't trust the media. So do we know if that is completely the work of MRC? Well, no, we don't know, but that has been our bailiwick all this time. So what we do, and the way that we do that is, first of all, we call them out on something that they have either reported on and distorted or outright lied about sometimes, or we call them out on instances where they don't tell the story, which we have come to find in this past election may have been the more important thing. We call that bias by omission. Bias by commission, they just don't tell the truth. They tend to fabricate things. They just do poor journalism intentionally. Or bias by omission. They don't tell the full truth. So we will then show very detailed, sometimes down to the second, for example, how often the media covered the president negatively versus how often they covered a previous president. So one of the stories that we did over the course of the Trump presidency was the amount of negative coverage on the evening newscasts. That's ABC, CBS, NBC, their news broadcasts for the president. Well, it was always consistently in the 90%. Well, that's absurd. To have 90% of the coverage about the president, over 90% of it be with all the successes that he had, and his administration did have them, over 90% be negative. And we showed that, and it was irrefutable. So as a result of studies like that, and there was another big study that we did at the end of the year, the American public, I think, no longer trusts this institution. That's the MRC.
Now, Brent, you mean Brent Bozell. Has he been there from the very beginning?
Brent started the organization. He has been the fountainhead for many different organizations. His father, of course, was a leader in the movement as well. He ghost wrote Conscience of a Conservative for Barry Goldwater. He, along with William Buckley, were kind of pivotal in starting up the modern conservative movement. So there's a legacy there. One of the things that you talked about that has become a recent concern of Brent's, and that well, is kind of a different species of media bias. It's the big tech censorship of conservatives on their platforms, on Twitter and Facebook and Google, YouTube. So we started up, as you alluded to, we started up the Free Speech Alliance, which now is at over 70 organizations here in the US and some abroad, to combat the censorship of conservative voices on social media. So it doesn't just stop with the broadcast networks or the old legacy newspapers. Big tech is picking up where they left off.
No doubt about it. Now, of course, I would be remiss in not mentioning, if I didn't, Rush Limbaugh and his passing and the tremendous role he played. Of course, Rush Limbaugh got started in the days before the internet, in the days before Twitter and Facebook and a lot of these tech companies, but he really kind of set the stage. And MRC, Media Research Center, also in terms of calling into question some of the media bias that quite frankly have been going on for decades in the
Yeah.
United States. Talk about that relationship.
Well, so the term that Brent always uses is he's very big on marketing. I mean, we talk a lot about marketing and brand in addition to our mission and the importance of that. And so, as you'll recall, around the time right before Rush came out, that the media were very biased. And so, when we started doing, and people, they knew it intuitively, but when we started doing our work, and there really weren't a lot of other organizations or individuals who started doing it, but we kind of conditioned the market for it. Accuracy in Media was another organization that was doing it, Rita Irvine. But people, once they started reading and internalizing our stuff, and the work of others, people that were other people, prominent conservatives that were calling out the media, and they started getting to be more skeptical of what it was that they were listening to, what they were reading, what they were hearing. They wanted something else. And in a sense, that skepticism created a market demand for something else. People were no longer happy with the product they were given. They didn't trust the media. So along comes this guy, Rush Limbaugh, who had by his own admission, he had failed at a whole bunch of different projects, all in the broadcast industry. But then it was the really perfect timing. Rush had a talent. I think the way that I characterize this, he had a talent for vocalizing what people were thinking. So, when he would talk, and normal people too, not ivory tower people, and normal everyday people that were listening to him while they were making deliveries or picking the kids up, and people would listen to it and they'd say, you know what, that is what I believe. And if I could articulate as well as this guy, that's what I would believe. But what Rush came in, I think, because there was this huge gaping market deficit in the market, and he took it and he went with it. And I think that as a result, the conservative movement is, still stronger. But I think that the origins of Rush did come about because of the media's bias, ironically.
Yeah, now, of course, we are dealing with a whole different host of issues with tech companies and Facebook and Twitter, and of course, Parler being booted offline. In my estimation, the most recent, although, pick your most recent major issue in this area. But for me, as the father of three girls, it's the cancellation of Disney Plus that is resonating through my household because of the firing very unfairly of Gina Carano, who was one of the stars of The Mandalorian. And it's just a laundry list. I guess other people, would talk about the host of the Bachelorette series. Not one that I watched myself, but so many areas in which you have this blatant putting your thumb on the scale, if you will, among these media companies, including Rush Limbaugh in his passing. The way Twitter allowed people to say some really awful things on Twitter that if you said that about Ruth Bader Ginsburg or some other luminary who passed, you would get sent to Twitter jail. Talk a little bit about how these issues, long-standing as they are, have really taken hold in today's tech companies, tech culture.
Wow, where to start? I mean, we
I
could
know,
have
big
a whole,
question.
yeah, we could have a whole series of podcasts on this. So let me start off at kind of the higher level, the 50,000-foot level, and we can drill down if you like. But I would say that one of the things that we have seen, let me start with the traditional media and then wrap it in here. One of the things that we have seen over the past 4 years, ever since Trump came down those escalators in Trump Tower, was the rather dramatic transformation of the media from at least the pretense of trying to be objective to outright advocacy journalism. And advocacy journalism, not for liberalism, but the radical left. So there is this, the media are the radical left. The radical left know very much how to use the media. Before this election, as you'll recall, in 2016, the folks at Google did not, when Trump won, they were all shocked. How could this have happened? And there were meetings that were leaked where the top executives at Google were literally crying and lamenting the election of Donald Trump. And they said, we can't let this happen again. This is kind of like the noble lie from Plato, that we are going to use our power to do what's right for the folks. Mark Zuckerberg, Jack Dorsey agreed. And their policies that they employ on their platforms, along with what I would argue are statist statutory policies, especially those that are in Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, their extreme ideology, basically it was a deadly combination, and it came together, and their ideology, the statutory climate, their market power, their hatred of the president, they came together and they decided that they were not going to let him win the election. And I will give you Exhibit A, and it's just one, but it's a very powerful one among dozens. But we went out and we asked voters, overall Biden voters, people who had already voted for President Biden, did you know about the Hunter Biden story? One story. And this was something that was buried on Twitter and throttled on Facebook. And there's no denying it, and they admit it. And as a result of not knowing about this, among the Biden voters that we talked to, 4.7% said they would not have voted for Biden. Now, that is the most consequential decision that you could make as a citizen, right? Voting for the president of the United States. In one survey phone call, one question, explaining what it was in one question, the very people that had voted for him said, 4.7% of them said, I would not have voted for him. That is an election. That is the power of big tech. And that is the tip of the iceberg. And they are insinuating themselves into the government. They are changing people's public policy minds. They are insinuating themselves around the world. They are dominating the market. It is, and in conjunction with Amazon, which controls a large amount of the servers, and PayPal. This is a problem that we may not have ever, as a free society, that we may never have outside of war, perhaps, has never been a bigger threat to our free society.
Yeah, no, it's a really troubling issue. Now, I know, Rio Grande Foundation, we definitely want to talk about what you are doing with this coalition. But before we move on to that, is it inherent in media companies, media people, that they have some kind of left-wing perspective, and that all filters down? I mean, I remember, when this whole social media revolution, internet revolution was getting started, and at least on the outside, the media were calling them libertarian types, that the tech people had a libertarian viewpoint. And that's certainly not where things have gone today. What's kind of causing this whole situation, to the best of your knowledge? I know that's another huge question, but are these just left-wing people, Jack Dorsey and the Google guys and Twitter guys, or are they being kind of pushed by some unseen forces or seen forces to take these unfair positions?
Well, so a great deal of this is speculation, but I would say it's informed speculation. Okay, so let me proceed along the before. I don't want this to come across as being declarative. It's speculation, but well informed. I think that with Mark Zuckerberg and Jack Dorsey and Sundar Pichai and Jeff Bezos, I think that all those guys, you can safely say they are ideologues. They are people who come into the world and go into public policy ideas with these principles that they are trying to make fit into reality. That's what leftists do, and unfortunately, I think it's what even some of our libertarian friends do. And as kind of a part of that, they have this utopian view of what society ought to look like. Whether it works out or not doesn't matter. These are the ideas. It's almost like a religion. These are the ideas that we have about what society must look like. And so, and by the way, it's informed by this this idea of, as Thomas Sowell says, of the anointed, right? I mean, they think that they are the right. They are think that they are good, and that if people would just do what they think, this is the way the radical left thinks, Marxism, that everything would be better. So I think that they are all coming at it to varying degrees with that mentality. And then they have this, massive market power, and they use this in conjunction with their ideas of, so quote unquote, hate. What is hate? And this really, that hate, that their hate speech policies are blanket concept ideas for what they determine to be just and what they determine to be right. And I think it gets to be, reinforcing. I think that, oftentimes, even like with many people that come to DC, they get lost in the game. People that are conservative and come to DC and are very conservative, they almost get corrupted in a sense. So I think that there is, in media organizations, in traditional ones, there are a whole bunch of psychological reasons why folks who are more liberal, because they tend to be more idealistic and more utopian in their thinking, tend to be drawn towards these things. But then once these very high level CEOs wield the power that they do, and they see the results, and they have sycophants all around them who are saying, yes, you are right, I think it gets to be self-reinforcing. And they, say, you know what, we really can change the world for good. There was a memo that leaked out of Google, and they say that it's completely benign, but it is flat out creepy. It's called the Good Censor, and I would encourage anyone to go read it. But it really does, if you read in between the lines, you can see there is this mentality. We know what's right for society. We know what's good for you. And if you only comport to where we're coming from, then everything will be all better. Just trust us. And it gets to be, like I said, I think it gets to be self-reinforcing when they see what effect they're able to have.
Got it. That's a very good point. So the Media Research Center, you guys have been, like you said, at it for a long time, but recently, and you can talk about when exactly this got started and who is and who can be a part of it, the Free Speech Alliance, and what you're trying to do with that. So talk about the Free Speech Alliance and some of your efforts, because this is a delicate issue for free market people. I mean, on one hand, we don't want the government to come in, certainly, and start dictating to these tech companies. But on the other hand, we want to put some kind of pressure on them to stop discriminating based on ideological perspective. So the Free Speech Alliance is what, and what other efforts relating to this issue are you undertaking?
So I would encourage anybody that wants to learn more about this, first of all, go to mrc.org/Free Speech Alliance. And if you go on that, and I'm looking at the webpage right now, if you go and you look on it, on the front page, there are four things that we have had that we have on there, and none of these things call for any type of government intervention. Now we have started to go in that direction, and we can talk about that a little bit. And I know that divides some of us on the right, but I don't think it ought to. And again, we can talk about that. But the things that we have said need to happen with social media, there are four. If they really do want to be these platforms for good, if they want to be kind of neutral platforms, open platforms where everyone can have a voice, which for all intents and purposes is what they said they need to do. They need to do these four things. One, they need to provide transparency about what it is that they're doing inside these organizations. They're like black boxes. They need to provide clarity on hate speech. I talked about that a little bit. Right now, it is just you look at Facebook's hate speech policy, and it is just a bunch of gobbledygook. They need to provide clarity on that. Personnel's policy, they need to provide equal footing for conservatives at their organizations. And then we say that they need to mirror the First Amendment. So we understand the Constitution. We recognize that the First Amendment applies to the federal government. But it is the spirit of the First Amendment that these organizations need to mirror. Why is that? It is because they are so dominant, they are so large, that I think it is very arguable, and I'm not the only one who has made this argument, that they are de facto state actors, and they have the ability to swing elections. So for the good of society, really civil society, they need to be thinking about, we will not do anything that throttles free speech. Just as the federal government cannot get involved in that, we will not do that either. We will encourage it. So that's the concept there. That's what the Free Speech Alliance is all about. It has members in free market think tanks and individuals, organizations from abroad in South America and Australia and Europe. So it's international as well. But that's kind of the hub, those principles.
Got it. Now, one of the critical issues or discussion points, it's not just about giving different viewpoints equal time and not censoring one side or the other, but when you start talking about this issue, you quickly start hearing the term Section 230, and that is something that, quite frankly, when this whole situation started to get on the Rio Grande Foundation's radar screen, and I started to try to learn about media censorship and these tech companies, I thought, what the heck is Section 230? Can you talk about Section 230? I know it sounds really dry, but it's got some very interesting principles and issues addressing this entire issue wound up in it.
Sure. So, there are attorneys who really parse this thing out and who really can get into the details on it. But here are the basics. The Section 230 is a section of the 1996 Communications Decency Act. And what Section 230 says, and at the time, no one, and it's obvious, it's over 24 years old, very old at this point. It's outdated. And what Section 230 of the CDA says is that online platforms, not publishers, online platforms where there are guest comments or people that are posting on a platform, those entities cannot be held liable for the information that is, unless it's criminal, for the information that is posted on those. This is a thumbnail sketch. I mean, they're much more technical, but they can't be liable for things that people are posting on there, and that those organizations have the right to censor people if they are doing things that that don't comport with the law at the time, or other agreed upon norms and standards. One of the terms, this isn't the only one, this isn't the only issue, but one of the terms that's listed in that statute is they are allowed to censor for otherwise objectionable material. And therein lies a huge part of the problem. What in the world is otherwise objectionable material? Well, this is where hate speech comes into play. These organizations have really had used carte blanche, very discretionary, wide interpretation of otherwise objectionable to censor voices that they deem hateful or dangerous or not allowing people to exist in a safe space. And what has that specifically resulted in? That's resulted in the censorship of conservative voices. So that is just one issue. I mean, the age is another one, I think, but there's your thumbnail sketch of Section 230, and I think what is perhaps one of the biggest problems with it.
Now there's talk, I know President Trump, when he was in office, talked about, or at least I think I remember this, talked about eliminating it, and there's other discussion of reforming it in Congress. It's a very controversial issue, and as I understand it, there's at least some on the left that want to change Section 230. Now, obviously, when you get into the details here, it can cause vast disagreements, and you can get into some pretty tricky areas. But what is your take, Media Research Center, Free Speech Alliance? What is kind of your overall view on Section 230? Should it be changed? Should it stay the same? Enforced differently? Gotten rid of entirely? Where are you?
Well, the first thing I should say is MRC does not have any public policy position on this. So that's the first. So whatever I say, this is not MRC's position. This is Christian Robey's position. So I tend to be, and I think a lot of my libertarian friends would be somewhat shocked by this, but I tend to be very friendly towards libertarian principles. I worked at a couple of free market think tanks, and I interned at Cato. So I would say that I'm very, very friendly towards those things. I'll start off with the philosophical, and then I'll go to the specific. Philosophically, I tend to have problems with, if at all possible, with statutory. If I think statutory law can be oftentimes problematic for free market folks. Because it is not compatible if you think about it with the market. Sometimes you got to have statutory law, but you're making rules for a whole group of people that are entirely different. They're all very different. And you're doing it from that point forward. You have no idea what's going to happen in the future and what the market is going to do. So first of all, the principle of Section 230 was made, that piece of law was made without any concept of where Facebook or Twitter or Google would do, and what Amazon and what impact they would have. So that's the first thing. Is I have a problem with it in principle, because statutory law is just, I think, a very cumbersome thing. The second thing I would say that I have a problem with it is it picks winners and losers, right? So you say, we think that, and I tend to agree with this, but I'm not sure the government has a role in playing with this. We think that these platforms are good things. It's a value judgment. So we are going to enshrine into law something that we think is going to protect them. You are picking a winner here. You're making value judgments, and it violates, in my mind at least, the principle of laissez-faire. So that's where I'm coming from. That is where I would come from in terms of the free market approach to this. Is I think that there's the possibility that Adam Smith and Bruno Leone, who wrote Freedom in the Law, that both these guys would have problems with this. Now, in terms of the specifics, now we're here. We have 230. We have, if we were at this point, I think if we were to get rid of it entirely, it'd be chaos. I think it would destroy the internet. A lot of these organizations, they would just censor everybody because they wouldn't want to get in trouble. The floodgates to litigation would be open. So I think that it has to be amended. Section 230 has to be amended. And I think that it has to be amended such that if these companies are throttling people, they need to show the burden is on them. They need to show that they did so because these organizations were violating law, that they were basically the entities that they were censoring were crying fire in a crowded movie theater, or they were posting child pornography, or they were organizing terrorist networks. So I think that it needs to be organized along those lines, and otherwise, I think that if that is not the case, then there needs to be a right to civil action, to lawsuit against these organizations. They have it's like a shield. 230 is like a shield for these organizations. So I think that they need to, just like the New York Times is open to litigation or the Washington Post, I think that these organizations need to be.
All right. Well, that is a fair assessment, and I think very reasonable. So, it's one thing to penalize somebody, and I mentioned Gina Carano. You could talk about a lot of other conservative figures who have lost access, from President Trump or former President Trump on down to a lot of other voices broadly on the right who get temporary or permanent bans on Facebook and these social media outlets. It's another thing to do what's called deplatforming. And, Parler is kind of the conservative alternative, one of the alternatives to Twitter and Facebook. And, there was a push after the January 6th Capitol riots to kind of move maybe conservative voices who were being banned on Twitter onto this alternative platform. But then they lost their ability to be online. And I'm actually trying to get to Parler's website. I guess they supposedly came back up recently, but I haven't actually been able to log on to Parler. And I just wanted to talk about the specific kind of that seems like a next level thing. It's one thing for Twitter to ban somebody. It's another thing to eliminate an entire alternative platform from the internet. So talk about that.
Well, so this gets back to, I think, the kind of the free market dilemma here. Again, I'm very, and I like to think very well informed. I'm very friendly to free market principles. I think a lot of my free market libertarian friends would say, these are private organizations. They have the right to do whatever they want. Here's the problem. These organizations exert unparalleled power. And they have the ability, if they want, at any time, and by the way, the desire, and they show this, to eliminate organizations and individuals from the modern means of communication, completely erase their existence. So Facebook, a huge amount more, majority of people use Facebook. Google is used as a search platform by over 90%, I think 86% of the market worldwide. And Twitter is very influential among journalists. Now, you combine that, so if an organization is censored on Facebook and Twitter, which has happened, and then they are deplatformed from Amazon, and Google pushes them. All of these things are possible below the 12 blue links, the first page. Guess what? That organization, for all intents and purposes, that voice no longer exists. And then you have the issue where you're no longer having, in Lockean terms, there is no longer this idea of healthy discussion, free speech. That's gone. It's one-sided. And they've done that. And so I would say that conservatives but especially libertarians need to wake up and realize that these people are pernicious, and that, they, again, I alluded to this idea of the noble lie, from Plato, the idea that you have to deceive people for their own good. And there's this, this memo coming out of Google, that the good censor, very similar. They think it is perfectly right for them to do what they what they are doing. And I would just, to censor and to deplatform people. So, there, if anyone's interested, there's a really good book called Left Turn by a professor at George Mason. His name escapes me right now, but he talks about the influence of media bias on people's public policy positions, and it pertains to social media too. These organizations can actually change, through censorship and through suppressing search on their search engines. They can change the way that people think about public policy and culture, and change our country. And, we'll wake up after, an election and no longer have a free society, and will never be able to have a free society again. I think that that is a real threat. And I think that that makes those organizations, an oligarchy.
Yeah. Now, just a kind of devil's argument here. We're having this discussion in part on Facebook Live, which of course is one of the big tech companies that has been known to censor conservatives. I actually Googled the good censor while we were talking, and it came right up. So you can use Google's own searches against it, if you will. It's not like they say this document does not exist, go use DuckDuckGo or some other company's search tool to find this document. I mean, I'm being slightly facetious there, but
right.
You get the idea here, is that we're obviously living with a double-edged sword, in the sense that these are very useful tools that allow us to do a lot of things, but there's no doubt in anyone's mind, any honest liberal would say the same, that they are biased against conservatives. So, what's the average person to kind of think or do with this entire situation? Because it's a minefield out there.
There is, again, you're getting to a very good free market argument, right? So here we are, kind of the cranks, the conservative cranks, and we use Facebook very effectively and very well, right? So it isn't it a service? A couple of things, as we saw in this last election, and ultimately elections determine, I would argue, they determined the fate of our Republican form of government. And Joe Biden was one of the most radical liberal. He's not, a moderate guy. He's a radical. And they are going to push through, as we're already seeing, some pieces of legislation that are, I think, going to send the country into hyperinflation, worse than what we saw with Jimmy Carter. That takes 3% of the vote in a small amount of swing states. So you can go ahead and you can Google, what you want and get contrarian voices. You can use Facebook Live and you can talk about what you want by their permission, as long as it's, not going to damage what they need to be done too much. The Hunter Biden story, they're going to throttle that. But, this is my very cynical take. My very cynical take is that we kind of, thank them for letting us exist. Thank you so much for letting us say what we want to say. But really and truly, they're like the puppet masters behind the curtains. They are controlling where this society is going. And meanwhile, everybody thinks that they have freedom. Now, freedom of speech, etc. I will just point out something that I think everybody should go and read, because it's a forgotten piece of literature in our, as far as I can tell, in kind of our libertarian lexicon here. Milton Friedman wrote something, Milton Friedman, in the New York Times Magazine in September 1970 called The Social Responsibility of Business is to Increase Its Profits. And one of the things that he talks about is that any corporation, any CEO of a corporation who does anything except for try to make money, he says this: in fact, they are, or would be if they or anyone else took them seriously, preaching pure and unadulterated socialism. So, the temptation is to say completely hands off, let these organizations, Facebook et al., do what they want. They have every right to do it. But, there is, in our libertarian tradition, there is actually a forgotten tradition that no, businesses have a responsibility to not get involved in hate speech, not get involved in swaying elections, not get involved in culture. They need to make money, period. And if they do anything besides that, they are the puppet masters of socialists. And I think that's what these guys are willingly doing. They are not, kind of the unwitting puppets of leftists. They are cooperating with a great deal of power. They are cooperating with radical leftists in the state.
Yeah, I believe there's a quote, I think it's from Lenin, about, we're going to hang all the capitalists and we're going to use the rope that they produce to do it, something along those lines.
What was that again? You blanked out for a second. What was it from Lenin?
That we're going to hang all the capitalists and we're going to use the rope that they make for us to do it.
Yeah, right. And wow, isn't that interesting? This gets, I will go back further, that there's a quote from, I think along the same lines, from Benjamin Franklin after the Constitutional Convention. And somebody apparently came up to him and said, well, Mr. Franklin, what type of government have you given us? And he said, a Republican form of government if you can keep it. That there is this great responsibility in a free society where you have to have a civil society that undergirds it, and a very specific type of civil society. And if you don't, you can say goodbye to that free society. Now, I would argue, along your lines, the Lenin lines that you're talking about, that it is eternal vigilance, that freedom requires eternal vigilance, and it requires a constant bodyguard, and that it's only one step away from one generation away from extinction. I mean, all these platitudes that all of us know. These social media platforms are a tool of the left, and if we do not push back on them, I think, and fight them and understand what they are and come together as a movement, by the way, I think that we only have ourselves to blame for our demise.
All right. Well, we pretty much have to wrap it up there. Why don't you share with people a little bit about Media Research Center and your efforts, websites, et cetera, any ways that average people can get involved? Because I know this is a tricky situation. I did, like I said, I got a little bit of a good feeling just canceling Disney Plus.
Good.
But that's all. that's a small thing to do in this whole battle. But how can people fight back?
So a couple ways they can fight back. One is just to be informed. So there is the classic newsbusters.org. And I think that there is knowledge and power, and we document all the ways that the media are biased. And then on newsbusters.org, up at the very top, there is a section called Tech Watch, and that speaks directly towards the issues that we are talking about. We have documented at our website, centertrack.org, CENSORTRACK.org. It's kind of like a database for all the instances of bias. And I would just urge everyone to go there and check that out. If they are writing on this, if they want to post on it. And by the way, this is a much longer conversation. I think people need to be engaging on social media. It sounds paradoxical, but they don't want us on there. They want us out. We need to be on there fighting on their platform. So go to Censor Track, go to Newsbusters. On Censor Track, there is a sign up for our newsletter. Sign up there. And from there, you can get, you'll learn more, and we will introduce you to other ways that you can take action.
All right. Thank you very much for your time today, Christian. Really timely issue. So even with the legislative session going on here in New Mexico, I felt it was really important to get this information out there. And folks listening or watching on Facebook, I really hope that you'll engage. We're doing our best at the Rio Grande Foundation to try to keep on top of this issue, which of course we focus pretty much exclusively on New Mexico public policy, but this is something that's so fundamental to everything that we all do in trying to spread our messages that I felt it was very important. So appreciate your time today, Christian. And good luck up there. It's challenging these days. Thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to this show at Apple, Stitcher, and other podcasting sites, and have your Google Home play Tipping Point, New Mexico. Yes, they will still do that. We're not on that list. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.
Thank you, Paul.